Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really getting into something complex, what the research says about ADHD causes, specifically those factors way back before birth and in very early life. We know so many people listening want quick, clear answers, especially when looking back, trying to figure out, why. We want to cut through that noise for you.
Absolutely. And we have to start with a really key point here. It's the difference between something being associated with ADHD and actually causing it. That's the big challenge in this field. ADHD is, well, it's deeply rooted in genetics, but how those genes play out involves biology, the environment. It's a mix. Many things we'll talk about are linked, yeah, but exposure doesn't automatically mean a child will develop ADHD.
Okay, right. Let's unpack that. Starting before birth, the prenatal environment. Teratogens, or these are substances that can affect development, seem like a major focus.
They are, and alcohol comes up a lot. There's a big study, 2015, I think, looked at around 20,000 parents. It found about a 1.5 times increased risk for ADHD if the mother drank during pregnancy.
1.5 times. That sounds like a lot. But hang on, how do we separate that from fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, FASD? Because the symptoms can look really similar, can't they?
That's the critical question. FASD is caused directly by alcohol, and yes, the symptoms, major issues with attention, hyperactivity, impulse control, they massively overlap with ADHD. So if a clinician isn't really careful, they might diagnose ADHD when the root cause is actually FASD from the alcohol exposure. The alcohol definitely causes those symptoms, but maybe not ADHD itself in the way we usually think of it, even though the impact is just as real.
Okay, that distinction is crucial. What about tobacco then? Smoking during pregnancy.
Also a strong association. Maternal smoking linked to over 1.5 times the risk. And interestingly, paternal smoking before and during pregnancy seems linked too.
Right, that's often cited.
It is, but here's where it gets really interesting, and it highlights that whole association versus causation thing we started with. Some really clever studies, ones that managed to control for the underlying genetic links between parents and kids, found that association between mom smoking and ADHD. It often just vanished.
Whoa, hang on. Controlling for genetics makes the smoking link disappear. How does that work? Can you maybe give us a quick analogy?
Yeah, sure. Think of it like this. Maybe mom has genetic factors that increase her risk for ADHD. Those same genetic factors might also make her more likely to smoke, or perhaps find it much harder to quit, right? So her genes contribute both to the exposure, the smoking, and they're passed on, increasing the child's genetic vulnerability to ADHD.
Yeah.
So when researchers statistically kind of factor out that shared genetic risk, well, the smoking itself doesn't look like the main driver anymore. It suggests the environmental trigger was actually pointing towards the genetics underneath.
That's a huge clarification. It really shifts how you might view that risk, especially if you're a parent looking back. Less about blame.
Exactly. And honestly, the same caution applies to other substances we see linked. Opioids, for example, one study showed more than double the risk. Even common things like acetaminophen exposure in the womb. We see the association, but we just don't know yet if these substances have a causal effect separate from those shared genetic pathways.
Right. Okay, let's shift gears slightly. What about the mother's overall health during pregnancy? Things like metabolic conditions, obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure.
Yeah, they're often grouped together. There's an association with neurodevelopmental disorders generally, including ADHD. But the isolated risk for ADHD specifically seems relatively small, especially considering how common these conditions are.
So if the risk is small, why the research focus?
Well, researchers are kind of looking for a bigger pattern. Maybe there's a common biological pathway like ongoing low-level inflammation or maybe hormone imbalances that connects these conditions to the baby's brain development. It points towards the overall gestational environment being maybe less optimal rather than just one single condition being the culprit.
Makes sense. And maternal stress, trauma during pregnancy.
That link seems stronger. A 2018 study found that high levels of maternal stress or trauma during pregnancy more than doubled the chances of the child later being diagnosed with ADHD or even conduct disorder.
And there's a clear biological reason for that one.
It seems so. Chronic stress elevates cortisol, other stress hormones. We know these can cross the placenta and directly impact how the fetal brain develops, especially in areas that, manage emotion and impulsivity, so the mechanism feels a bit more direct there than just correlation.
Okay, moving on from prenatal, what about right around the time of birth, perinatal factors? Things like birth complications.
Yeah, we definitely see links there. Problems involving oxygen deprivation, for instance. Birth asphyxia is associated with about a 26% higher risk of ADHD, and something called neonatal respiratory distress syndrome that's linked to a 37% greater risk.
Wow. Anything that compromises oxygen to the brain at that crucial time is obviously a big concern.
Exactly.
And C-sections, that comes up a lot too. Does having a cesarean delivery matter?
Well, a big review in 2019 looked at something like 20 million deliveries, did find a link between C-sections, whether planned or emergency, and a higher ADHD risk compared to vaginal birth.
But I sense a but coming.
Hey, yeah, the causality problem again. Was it the surgery itself, or was it the underlying reason for the C-section? Maybe preeclampsia or fetal distress. Were those the real drivers connected to ADHD risk? We just don't have that causal answer pinned down.
Okay. But you mentioned earlier that some factors do seem to have stronger, maybe even causal links from this period, like prematurity?
Yes. Prematurity and low birth weight. This is one area where the environmental factor seems pretty robust, even when you try to account for genetics. Babies born extremely preterm or with very low birth weight, they're about 3 times more likely to develop ADHD. And importantly, studies that controlled for genetics still found this link held strong.
So that suggests the biological stress of being born too early or too small has a direct, perhaps causal impact on brain development.
That's what the evidence points to, yes. A significant direct influence.
That's a really key finding. Okay, let's jump forward a bit now to early life exposures after birth. Lead, that's been a known neurotoxin for ages.
Oh, absolutely. Lead is just bad news for developing brains. The link with ADHD is strong, even at low exposure levels. And what's really fascinating here, researchers have actually built a pretty compelling case for a causal role. They've moved beyond just saying it's associated.
How did they manage to nail down causality for lead when it's so hard for things like smoking?
It was quite clever, actually. They used what you might call a natural experiment. They looked at a common gene variation called HFEC282Y. Now, this gene variant affects how our bodies handle metals, like iron, but it turns out it also affects lead processing. And this gene variant is just randomly scattered through the population. So they could compare kids who had high lead exposure, some with this gene variant and some without it.
Okay, so same exposure, different gene. What happened?
The kids with high lead exposure who also had that specific gene variant showed significantly worse symptoms of hyperactivity and impulsivity compared to the kids also exposed to lead but without the variant. It's like the gene amplified the lead's negative effect. If lead was just, linked because of poverty or some other environmental thing, that specific gene interaction wouldn't likely show up so clearly. It's some of the best evidence we have that lead causes ADHD-like symptoms.
Yeah. That is a powerful piece of evidence, and I assume there were links to other pollutants too.
Yep. Things like nitrous dioxide, basically traffic pollution, and persistent organic pollutants, they also show associations. But lead really stands out for that stronger causal evidence.
Okay, this focus on causality really shifts things. What about something like breastfeeding? Often hear it's protective against ADHD. Is that causal? Like, not breastfeeding increases risk?
Well, it is associated with a lower risk for sure. You see that correlation. But
Yeah.
some sophisticated statistical analyses, the kind you need to untangle these complex relationships, they actually suggest the causality might be flipped.
Flipped. How?
It might not be that the lack of breastfeeding causes ADHD. Instead, it could be that the infants who are already showing very early signs or temperamental traits related to ADHD, maybe more fussiness, difficulty settling, harder to soothe well, they were simply harder to breastfeed successfully or for as long. So their challenging behavior and early sign of the underlying condition might have led to shorter breastfeeding duration. The emerging ADHD potentially caused the reduced breastfeeding, not the other way around.
That completely turns it on its head and really highlights how early these underlying differences might appear. Okay, final area in this section, trauma. Especially adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs.
Right. AC is things like abuse, neglect, serious household dysfunction. Trauma's relationship with ADHD is really complex, and it seems to go both ways. It's bidirectional. So on one hand, a severe traumatic brain injury, for instance, that can definitely increase the risk for developing ADHD symptoms later. But on the other hand, having ADHD itself, partly because of challenges with impulse control and inhibition, makes a child more likely to experience trauma later on.
How so?
Well, kids with ADHD are, sadly, 2 to 3 times more likely to have accidental injuries, including head injuries, just due to impulsivity or not seeing risks. It can become this really unfortunate cycle. The ADHD increases risk for trauma, and then the trauma can make ADHD symptoms or related issues like conduct problems even worse.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground on these early risk factors. If we try to connect this all back to the bigger picture, what are the absolute core takeaways for someone listening?
I think there are maybe 4 main things to really grasp. First, like we've hammered home, proven causality is rare. Most of these factors are associations, often tangled up with shared genetics. They aren't necessarily the root cause themselves.
Right. Association isn't causation.
Got it.
Second, accumulation matters. These risks seldom happen in isolation. You often see clusters, maybe poverty, plus pollutant exposure, plus nutritional issues. It's the total load, a combination of various risks, including the child's underlying genetic vulnerability, that really seems to increase the likelihood of ADHD emerging. Okay, accumulation. And the third point feels really important, especially for parents who might be feeling guilty.
Yes. We really need to move past the old, frankly misguided tendency to blame mothers. So many potential risk factors like being born prematurely or unavoidable stress or living in an area with old lead pipes are just not things parents can control. Thankfully, the research focus is shifting. It's looking more at environmental improvements we can make, recognizing the huge protective role of things like, say, paternal support, and also realizing that paternal exposures before conception things affecting sperm health matter too. It's a shared environment.
That's a much healthier perspective. And the final key point.
Just to reiterate, even exposure to the factors with stronger evidence, like lead or extreme prematurity, it doesn't guarantee an ADHD diagnosis. Other vulnerabilities, likely genetic and maybe other environmental hits, need to align for the condition to actually develop.
It's complex. Okay, so what does this all mean practically? We can't rewind time. The focus has to be on moving forward, right? Managing things now and in the future. What are the most actionable things people can do based on all this?
Number one has to be behavioral support, and this applies at any age, really. We're talking about behavioral parent training, or BPT.
BBT. Okay, why is that so crucial?
Because ADHD behaviors can be really challenging, right? And that can create a really negative cycle between parent and child frustration builds up. BPT isn't about fixing the child. It's about equipping the parent with structured, consistent, positive strategies and ways to respond.
Can you give an example of what that looks like? What does BPT actually teach parents?
Sure. It teaches practical things like setting up clear daily routines, using rewards effectively and consistently, having predictable consequences for behavior, and, crucially, communication techniques to minimize conflict and yelling. It's vital because it helps reduce that household stress, increases predictability, basically mitigating one of those accumulation factors we talked about, that chronic stress environment. Plus, there's a bonus. BPT often makes ADHD medication more effective, sometimes even allowing for a lower dose because the home environment is calmer and more structured.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, next actionable area seems to be nutrition, kind of circling back to some of those prenatal factors.
Definitely. For parents expecting, aiming for a healthy, balanced prenatal diet seems linked to less hyperactivity later on, and for kids already diagnosed. Managing potential deficiencies is key. We know kids with ADHD are statistically more likely to have low levels of certain nutrients. Iron, zinc, vitamin D are the big ones. If blood tests confirm these are low, then supplementing can help improve symptoms. Some specialized multi-nutrient supplements designed for ADHD also show some promise.
And omega-3s. You always hear about fish oil.
Yep, and for good reason. Omega-3 fatty acids, especially EPA and DHA, are crucial for brain health. And again, kids with ADHD often have lower levels. Supplementing maybe around 1,000 milligrams of EPHA combined daily seems to offer modest improvement in symptoms for some, and prenatal omega-3s have also been linked to better attention development down the road.
Okay. What about elimination diets? Removing certain foods.
That's a bit more complex. They might help a subset of children, maybe somewhere between 5 to 25%, according to some studies. This usually involves removing common allergens or artificial additives, but, and this is a big but, it absolutely needs to be done carefully, ideally under the guidance of a clinician or a registered dietitian. You need a proper plan to ensure the child still gets all the nutrients they need if you're removing entire food groups. It's not something to just try randomly.
Right. Professional guidance is key there.
Okay.
Moving on to the lifestyle basics that seem almost too simple but are maybe underrated. Sleep and exercise.
Hugely important. Don't underestimate them. Poor sleep is like pouring gasoline on ADHD symptoms. It makes everything worse. Focus, mood, behavior, functioning. For school-aged kids, you really want to aim for close to 10 hours a night, though it varies a bit by age. The key is consistency. A regular bedtime routine, and definitely getting screens out of the bedroom well before sleep time. That blue light is disruptive.
And exercise. The movement piece.
Get them moving. At least an hour of moderate to vigorous activity most days is the goal. Exercise directly benefits attention and focus, improves mood, boosts overall health. And interestingly, some animal research suggests exercise might even help reverse some biological effects of past stress or trauma. It's a powerful tool, totally non-drug, and it might even help reduce the need for higher doses of medication over the long term.
Okay, let's circle back to lead, since we singled that out as having stronger causal evidence. What are the practical steps there?
First step, if you live in an older home, especially built before, say, the late 1970s, getting your water and maybe even soil tested for lead is a really good idea.
And if the tester's okay? Or even if you can't test?
Even then, taking precautions is wise. Things like using water filters certified to remove lead, using HEP air filters indoors can help trap lead dust, being mindful of chipping paint in older homes or bare soil patches where kids play outside as they can ingest contaminated dust or soil. And again, nutrition helps here too. Making sure kids have adequate iron and vitamin D actually helps minimize how much lead their bodies absorb if they are exposed.
Good tips. Okay, nearly there. Screen time is always a hot topic.
It is. The research is still evolving, but there are cautionary findings. For example, one study linked excessive social media use in teenagers specifically to the later emergence of ADHD symptoms. Now, does the screen cause ADHD? Probably not directly, but spending excessive time on screens often means less time for sleep, less physical activity, fewer face-to-face interactions, all things that definitely don't help manage ADHD symptoms. The content can matter too. Links between violent content and aggression exist, especially for vulnerable kids. So moderation and mindful use are key.
And finally, something maybe less obvious but critical: parent self-care.
Absolutely essential. This isn't selfish, it's actually a protective factor for the child. If you, as the parent, are dealing with your own high stress, maybe a history of trauma or mental health challenges, managing that is paramount, stick to your own treatment plan. Get support. Because parental stress is a known environmental influence that directly impacts the child's well-being. It can feed into that difficult bidirectional cycle we talked about earlier. Taking care of yourself helps break that cycle.
Right. Wow, we've really covered a huge amount today. The main things sticking with me are that true single causes are rare. It's more about the accumulation of risks, often linked to genetics, and that focusing on blame for the past is way less helpful than focusing on what we can influence now, like the BPT, nutrition, sleep, exercise, reducing pollutants.
That's exactly the path forward. Which kind of leads us to a final thought, something for you to really chew on after listening. Given that the genetic risks for ADHD are pretty much fixed, right? But we do have solid evidence that some environmental factors like lead or maybe chronic stress or nutrition have demonstrable effects, either making things worse or better. How much untapped potential is there, really, in optimizing the environment across a person's whole life? How much could that help regulate a condition we often think of as just fixed neurology?
That's a powerful question. Definitely gives a lot of incentive to focus on those modifiable factors. Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We really hope this gives you useful knowledge to move forward with.